Good morning. I have the pleasure to warmly welcome and introduce our next guest speaker, our Minister for Climate Change, the Honourable James Shaw. Minister Shaw has a passion and a vision for New Zealand and our future. He's been spending plenty of time within our sector and is very keen to work with us to realise these opportunities. So could you please warmly welcome to the stage Honourable James Shaw.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, and good morning. Thank you very much for having me. I just wanted to start by acknowledging Jim van den Pol and Tim Mackle, in particular from DairyNZ. I've had shall we say, a very constructive relationship with the team from DairyNZ over the course of the last few years, both when I was in opposition and now that I am in government, and I've really appreciated the efforts that they have gone to reach out and to give me an education and to get me out on farm and talking to people who are involved in some of the different sectors and so on, and some of the policy advice that they've had to offer. So it is a real pleasure for me to be here with you all today, and I just wanted to say I think that you've got one of the best industry groups that I have come across, and I deal with a fair few in my line of business. I think they do an outstanding job. So thank you very much to DairyNZ. And I also want to acknowledge you all, the farmers here in the audience. The media doesn't make a lot of money, selling stories about people being nice to each other. So I want you to hear this from me. I think you're doing a great job. And that may come as a bit of a surprise to some people, given some of the headlines over the last few years. But the progress that I have seen in the last few years, I just think has been absolutely remarkable. And one of the things that I really enjoy, one of the things that actually is a real highlight for me, is to come to the field days every year and try and get a bit of a sense of what's going on, and it just blows my mind. I'm a city boy. I was born and raised in Wellington and spent most of my career, my adult life in London and Europe and North America and so on. But I come from a line of farmers out in Portuguese in the Eastern Bay of Plenty. And when I talked to my uncle, who was the last farmer on that family farm there, some of the stories that he tells me about, we would simply never get away with today. And it just is apparent about how much things have changed over the course of time in the sector. I mean, it is quite extraordinary. And it's on the subject of change that I wanted to kick off. So I actually got here early. I wanted to see Damien's speech, and I wanted to see Cameron Baggery's speech as well. Not because I wanted to make sure that Damien was saying all the right things or anything, but because I was really interested in particular in what Cameron had to say. And I couldn't find much to disagree with, actually. I thought it was a brilliant presentation. It scared the bejesus out of me, and I hope that it didn't scare the bejesus out of you, but it's sort of, I then sort of started to rewrite what I was going to say by starting off and talking about change and the nature of change, which was one of the things that he was really kind of hitting, that theme of the only constant being change. But that's always been true. And I guess in my job, I've got this piece of work which is around getting to a net zero emissions economy by the year 2050, 32 years from today. But if you cast your mind back 30 years, I was in kind of late high school, 1988, and the internet didn't exist. It might have been a US Defense Department project at that time to survive a nuclear war with the Soviet Union, which did exist at the time, but the internet itself, as we know it today, did not exist. And now it is one of the critical pieces of infrastructure that underpins the entire economy. Internet technologies and services and products in New Zealand are one of the fastest, if not the fastest growing sector of the economy. It is not inconceivable that in the next couple of decades we will be making more revenue from ICT than we will from tourism or from agriculture as a portion of our economy. And yet 30 years ago, the piece of technology that enables that to happen simply wasn't there, didn't exist. If you think in your business, how much of it relies on the internet and some of the activity we've had and some of the argy-bargy over rural broadband over the course of the last decade or so, to make sure that you are actually connected at the highest possible speed to the world through that system. And, you know, there have been tremendous upheavals as a result of the arrival of that technology, and also incredible opportunities that have taken place as well. And one of the things that Cameron was talking about is in the next kind of 10 to 30 years, we are going to have to grapple with the next industrial revolution, essentially new technologies built on the back of the internet that are going to be incredibly disruptive and also bring with it great opportunity. And so it's within that context that I think about the transition to the low carbon economy as well. In New Zealand, and I think in many parts of the world, but in my experience in New Zealand, we have tended to think about climate change and the transition to the low carbon economy as a sunk cost, right? So the argument that I have heard in the last sort of few decades, up until fairly recently, is, look, New Zealand's emissions as a portion of the global total are tiny, absolutely tiny, less than 1% of the total, and it's kind of really expensive to do anything about it, so why would we bother, right? When you've got China and the US and the European Union and India and so on, who are the kind of the big guys in this department. And I kind of, there are parts of that argument that I get, there are parts that I don't. But it's the nature of thinking about it as a cost, I think, that has actually pulled us apart and meant that we haven't actually been able to make progress on this. Because actually, if you think about an alternative framing, which is as an investment, if you think about it as an investment, then you're always looking for a return on that investment. So what is the return that we can get out of investing in this transition to to basically an upgrade in our economy? You know, one that is higher value, higher productivity, higher wage, higher returns than the one that we've got at present. And so that is, I think, if we can think about that in terms of the economic opportunity, then I think we're going to make some progress. And until we make that switch, I don't think we will make any progress, because we'll always be pulling in different directions. The economic imperative will be seen as pulling in one direction, while the environmental imperative will be pulling in another. And so, you know, when Damien talks about, this vision for the economy and for farming, for agriculture, as this producer of really high value protein and food for the rest of the world, sold to the most discerning customers in the world, that is the opportunity that we're talking about. And so, we're completely aligned on that. And I think it's within that context that we have to frame everything that we do, because if we don't, we're not going to get in there anywhere. And so we do have this leadership position in agriculture and farming around the world. And it's not just a matter of preserving that position, but actually thinking about how do you maintain that in this changing world that we're in, and what is the next version of leadership that we're talking about, because that version of leadership that we've had for decades, for 100 years, that has changed over the course of that time, and it will continue to do so again in the future. So where are we at the moment? We do know, and agriculture is the sector that is probably most exposed to the negative effects of climate change, and anyone who was around in New Zealand over the course of the last summer would know that we have seen an increase in the frequency and severity of extreme weather events, whether that's droughts or floods or fires or cyclones, of which we had 3 Pacific cyclones make landfall in New Zealand over the summer, which caused tremendous damage in various parts of the country. You know that a number of sectors in the economy are exposed. Well, we're all exposed to some degree, but actually our rural sector is particularly exposed in the future in terms of the frequency and the severity of those effects. Just before Christmas, we released a couple of reports. One was the new coastal guidance from the Ministry for the Environment about how you plan for developments along the coastline. The other was the first of 2 reports from something called the Climate Change Adaptation Technical Working Group, snappily summarised as CATWAG around our office. And that report, or those 2 reports together, kind of gave us a sense of kind of some of the assets that are at risk. And it includes 5 airports, 50 kilometres of railway, 2,000 kilometres of road, 47,000 houses, and so on. About $19 to $20 billion worth of infrastructure, just kind of exposed from increasing risk of sea level rise over the coming decades. And so one of the things that we've got to think about it, just in terms of that, is what do we do about all of that? We had a number of kind of reports come out about the kind of changing weather patterns and how that was going to start affecting New Zealand. But I think it was because of this particular summer that there's been a bit of a change in consciousness, because it's not really, you can look at the data and the science all you like, but it's not really until people have a lived experience of it that they start to kind of go, oh, maybe there's something going on here. And I think this last summer kind of gave us that. In terms of New Zealand's emissions profile, you don't need me to tell you what the story is, but there are a couple of facts that I'd like to acknowledge, because I think that they give us a sense of some hope that we can do something about this. Methane emissions are up about 5% on 1990 levels. Transport emissions are about 24% on 1990 levels. Emissions per unit of production in agriculture are actually down about 1% a year over the course of the last 10 to 15 years or so. And so what that suggests is actually you can bend the curve. In the domain of electricity, about 4 or 5 years ago, we actually started using less electricity per unit of production or per unit of GDP than we had ever before. So we actually, for the first time in our history, decoupled economic growth from electricity use. And so what that suggests is that changing technologies, increasing productivity and so on, can actually bend that curve. We aren't actually shackled to the way that things are at the moment. We also know that the change that we're talking about is a whole of economy thing. And one thing I am absolutely committed to is to destroying this myth that this is all about and only about the agricultural sector. Right? And a lot of the rhetoric that I saw before the election about the town-country divide and so on, that really distresses me, because if we kind of allow that to take hold, and if that continues, then we are simply going to continue the argy-bargy that we've had for the last couple of decades, and we're not going to make any progress at all. This is about all of us, right? And everybody's got their part to play. Auckland City is the source of 20% of our total emissions. Right, we've got to bend the curve in Auckland. If we don't, nothing's going to happen, in terms of making any progress on our targets. I know water's not climate change, right? But the two, there's obviously a relationship. But the E. coli numbers in our cities are multiples of the E. coli numbers in our rural areas. And we know from the Havelock North inquiry into what happened over there, that pretty much the country's urban water system is buggered, and we've got to do something about that, right? So, this is not down to one sector. This is about all of us, and all of us in this together. It's going to take all of us, and it's going to take everything that we've got. So I just hope that, whatever else you hear, that you kind of comprehend that from me. The last national government signed us up to the Paris Agreement on climate change. And I wouldn't recommend wasting your time reading it, but there are a few important things that it says. First of all, it says that the whole world, and there is one caveat to that, the whole world has signed up to this idea that we want to hold global warming to somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And we've probably passed the 1.5 degree, or about to pass the 1.5 degree level already, but there's still time to hold us to 2 and perhaps well under 2. And if we're going to do that, what it says is that actually the whole world has to get to a net zero emissions economy in the second half of the century. So sometime between 2050 and 2100, literally every country is obliged to get to that point. So we have set ourselves a target of getting there by 2050, so at the front end of that range. But the point is that by signing the Paris Agreement, we actually committed ourselves to the goal of being a net zero emissions economy. And in fact, the target that Prime Minister John Key set about 10 years ago, which is a 50% reduction in our emissions across all sectors and all gases by the year 2050, the transformation that is required for that is enormous. And actually, if you're going to do all of those things, you know, what that requires, for example, is getting between 50 and 80% of our light vehicle fleet converted to electrics over the course of the next 30 years. To get from 50% below 1990 levels to net zero, it requires somewhere between 80 to 90% of our ground vehicle fleet to be electric by the year 2050. So all of the same transitions have to take place. And what we're having a conversation really about is speed, and that's about it. Now, I know some of you will be thinking, but what about the United States? Right, when I say every country on earth, and I acknowledge that, right? So the interesting thing about the US is, first of all, while they have said that they will withdraw, they've also said that they may not withdraw if they can, kind of get some alternate arrangements, and that's to do with things like transparency of international reporting and a bunch of other things. But the other thing is that they are actually going to hit their target without actually being a part of it, because the scale of technological change that's sort of zipping through the US energy and transport sectors in particular, but also through other sectors, is so large that actually their emissions are, that the curve on that is really coming down, led by places like California and so on, which are themselves very large economies. So that's kind of where we're at. And what I want to just kind of give you a bit of a heads up about is what our program of work is about. And Cameron, I think, laid out a very good challenge. He said all of this change is happening, right? Change has always happened. There's a whole lot more change to come. It's happening in a number of domains, whether it's technology or environment or customer demand here or around the world in our key markets. All of that's happening. And the question is, how do we get ahead of that? How do we plan for it? Because in some of the transitions we have made in the past, we've done a bloody terrible job of it. And I'm thinking in particular about the 1980s. And you can argue about the extent to which the changes of the 1980s and 1990s were necessary, and the fact that they've kind of created the the economy and the society that we've got today. But regardless of where you land on that question, we kind of did that in a way that left, frankly, a lot of the country with post-traumatic stress syndrome. And it's made us very averse to risk and to change as a result. And we had communities, and industries and so on that were kind of left by the wayside. And we are absolutely committed not to having that happen again. We are absolutely committed to saying, actually, if these changes are coming, what we want to do is we want to get ahead of them. We want to have a plan for them, and we want to manage that transition as gently and as carefully as we can, which is why we're talking about this kind of 3-decade-long transition, which is actually a heck of a long time. And I'll be 77 in the year 2050, benign circumstances, of course, taken into account. And so I'll be interested to see where we land. But what we're trying to say is how do we get ahead of this for the first time? And it's not a discipline or a science or an art in New Zealand that we've got a great history of. So it is something that we're attempting to build. And that leads us to the first piece of work that I've got on my plate, which is the Zero Carbon Act. And the Zero Carbon Act is designed entirely to give investment certainty and a stable policy environment over the course of the next 30 years. So one of the things that we've heard a lot from the private sector is that there's a great deal of investment that has been held back in New Zealand because of the political flux around climate change related policy. So people haven't necessarily known where to put the big money on the table because government policy keeps chopping and changing. And I don't just mean between governments, when you get a Labour-led government or a National-led government. I actually mean sometimes within the lifetime of those governments, things have changed so dramatically as well that people have said, actually, we're just going to hold our money back or make some small investments because we're not sure where the long-run stuff is going to go. So the Zero Carbon Act is designed to try and deal with that unstable policy environment. And the first thing that it does is it sets that net zero emissions target in law and says, okay, well, that's what we're shooting for. And in many ways, that is the most important thing because it provides a sense of that certainty. The second thing that it does is it sets up a politically independent climate commission that sits apart from Parliament. And the job of the commission will be to help to kind of guide us on the way there through expert advice. We believe that it'll be stocked, or we intend that it'll be stocked with not just scientists, but also people who understand economics and the international competitive environment, people from the business community, and so on. And so people who can understand the context of the economic shift that we're talking about, as well as the science. And their job will be to advise Parliament and to guide Parliament in terms of some of the key decisions that Parliament has to make between now and then in order to kind of help to manage that transition. The third thing that we're envisaging that it will do is to have some kind of role in thinking about the adaptation challenge that we've got. So I referred before to the risk to, particularly coastal assets, but also floodplains and so on. And so it's becoming apparent that New Zealand doesn't have a good sense yet of the kind of risk exposure that we've got in relation to the effects of climate change. And we don't have very good planning systems to try and get ahead of that as well and to start that adaptation challenge. And it's going to be expensive no matter what you do, right? So let's say you're in a low-lying coastal town. You've kind of got three choices. You can do nothing, and ultimately that's going to be expensive because you'll be dealing with increasing kind of flooding events and all of that kind of stuff and cleanup costs. You can put in place an engineering solution, so levees and sea walls, or pipes and pumps and whatever have you. That's expensive, or you can shift, and that's expensive. So very quickly this becomes a financing question, and so one of the things that we've got to take a look at is what is the kind of the most economic construct that we can help to kind of manage that transition there as well. So that's the third piece that the Zero Carbon Act is designed to take a look at. And we're going to, I know there's probably, if you're anything like me, a bit cynical about government consultations. We've got a pretty big 8-week period in June and July around this particular piece of legislation because it is such a significant piece of legislation. And one of the things that we do these things the way government does them. They put together a discussion document. We hold town hall meetings, up and down the country and so on. But this time we've said, look, this is really big. We actually want other organisations to host these as well and host discussions. I have to say DairyNZ is the only organisation that has yet responded to that call. And DairyNZ are actually hosting 8 workshops up and down the country, I think, for us on that piece of legislation. So, I know you've got an interest in it. If you can spare the time, please feel free to turn up to one of those. The second piece of work that I've got, which is distinct but related, obviously, is changes to the emissions trading scheme. And I heard some of the questions to Damien before. There's a lot of criticism about the existing emissions trading scheme. I am actually probably its biggest critic. If you think about the purpose of an emissions trading scheme, it's to bring down the country's emissions, and in the time that we've had an emissions trading scheme, our emissions have gone up. So a lot of stuff's gotten traded backwards and forwards, but it hasn't actually done what it's designed to do, which is to bring your emissions down. And so it's fundamentally kind of not working the way that it's designed at the moment, and it doesn't do a bunch of the things that you would like it to do, such as give you credit for the stuff that you do on farm and all of that kind of jazz. And so we've got a pretty big program of work to reform that. That's going to go out for consultation after the Zero Carbon Act piece, so that'll be sort of August, September as well. So around that portion of the year, we're going to be throwing up some of those design questions to say, well, how do you think it should be fixed so that it can suit your purposes as well. Zero Carbon Act will go into Parliament in October. the emissions trading scheme changes will go, but it's a separate piece of legislation, that'll go into Parliament in, I think, about November, December sometime. So they're kind of roughly parallel, but one's slightly behind the other. And we hope to pass the Zero Carbon Act in April of next year and set up the Climate Commission in May, and so it'll kind of really hit the ground in about June. And the emissions trading scheme changes, we hope will get passed in the kind of back end of next year. And then depending on where we land in terms of some of those changes, we hope to have those executed fairly shortly afterwards. And that, in many ways, is to just kind of get it done and dusted and make sure people have got some certainty and know what the situation is. Now, in between those two things, there are some questions that we want to get a handle on, and one of these in particular will be a subject that's close to your hearts, and that is, does agriculture come into the emissions trading scheme? And the other is, how do you get to 100% renewable electricity generation? Because we have seen, we do want to make sure, like we said, that the electricity generation and the energy system as a whole also bring their emissions down over the coming decades. And so we've set up something called the Interim Climate Committee, which is basically a narrower scope kind of version of the Independent Climate Commission, and it is kind of starting work now, looking at those two questions, and it should give us a sense of where it lands, probably in about May or June of next year as well. So some of the questions that I'm getting, I'm not going to be able to give a definitive answer to, because we are waiting on this group of engineers and scientists and economists and so on to do their piece of work and to give us a clear landing page on that. But I can talk you through some of the kind of current thinking around that. The next piece of work that I'm working on is around this piece around adaptation. Like I said, we don't have a very good sense yet of the risks that we're exposed to, and we don't have a very good plan for dealing with those risks. So when the Climate Change Adaptation Technical Working Group gives us their final report in the next couple of months, I'm hoping that we're able to build a new line of work around that, and to make sure that we actually get that risk assessment, and then we do start the process of really good planning for how to deal with the effects of that, including the questions around financing some of that transition. Now, Cameron talked a lot about the need for increasing productivity through research and development and innovation, and I've got another project which is to set up a green investment fund that is specifically designed to galvanise private sector capital towards the kinds of initiatives that we're talking about over the course of the next few years, and I hope to have something to say about that in the next few months. But also, of course, in particular, in the domain of agriculture, we've got the Global Research Alliance, we've got the PGRC and the Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Research Consortium based out of Massey, and so on. And over the years we've put kind of tens of millions of dollars into that, either as government or also through the business community. And we know that we've absolutely got to continue, if not increase that level of investment, if we're going to get the kind of innovations that we're talking about. And to me, that is actually the most important part, right? So one of the things, and I'll just leave you with this story, but one of the things that really struck me when I was in Bonn last year at the 23rd United Nations Conference on Climate Change is that other countries are starting to think about this. Now, Bonn was as frustrating as a lot of these meetings are. We didn't make as much progress as we'd like, but one piece of progress that we did finally make, and that New Zealand has been pushing for a long time, is to allow the conversation around agriculture finally to take place, right? So we got that over the line, and that's pretty good. And one of the things, I had about half a dozen conversations with counterparts from other countries who said something interesting to me. They said, well, look, their emissions profiles are largely dominated by transport and energy, and agriculture is actually a pretty tiny portion of it. This is, of course, different to New Zealand's profile, where we have this very large portion that's from agriculture and a smaller portion from energy and transport. But the interesting thing is, these countries that started working on this about 10 years ago, the proportion of their profile from energy and transport, of course, is coming down because they've been working on it. And what they have noticed, perhaps unsurprisingly, is as that has happened, the portion of their profile from agriculture is increasing. And so all of them said to me, look, we know that probably in about 5 years' time, we're going to need to start dealing with agriculture. So what's New Zealand doing? They're already looking at us for leadership in this space. And to me, that's actually an incredible opportunity. And I'm getting the signal, so I will wrap the story up. That is an incredible opportunity for New Zealand, because if we can be the country that works out how to do the equivalent of, and you can language this how you like, net zero emissions agriculture, that itself is a source of tremendous value, not just in terms of our brand and reputation for our products, but also in terms of the intellectual property and the technology and so on that has to get developed in order for us to get there. And every country in the world is heading in that direction, albeit at different speeds. So if we can get there first, we can seize that opportunity. And if we don't, somebody else will. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.